Have you been trying to trust God, but you can't stop considering all of the negative possibilities? If so, stay tuned and I will teach you how to break free from limiting thoughts today. What is going on, everyone? We are back for another episode of Prospering with Christ. I hope that you had a wonderful week last week, and I hope that this week will be just as amazing to you as well. So for today's episode, we are discussing the topic of breaking free from limiting beliefs. This topic kind of ties in to what we were talking about in last week's episode because we were discussing 1 John chapter 5 verses 14 through 15, which basically tells us that in order for us to get our prayers answered and see God move in our lives, we have to be confident in Him, confident that He hears us, confident that He's going to come through, and confident that He's going to provide us with the answers and the blessing that He said. And in that episode, we talked about how confidence is going to be the part that many of us struggle with because our limited thoughts hinder us from fully trusting God on the things that He says. And if you're wondering what limiting thoughts are, limiting beliefs are thoughts that are in our head that we take in and we believe, and they stop us from dreaming big, pursuing goals, and moving forward. It's like every single time that you have a desire to dream big or pursue something that's out of your norm, you get these thoughts in your head and they hone in on your weaknesses, or they hone in on the things that you lack, and they use those things to remind you why this desire you have will never happen. So for example, God may be putting a desire on your heart and telling you, start posting on TikTok. But then all of a sudden you're about to do it. And then you get these thoughts in your head and they're telling you you're too old for that app. Maybe you're in your 40s. Maybe you're in your 60s. Maybe you're in your 90s. I don't know. But you have these thoughts that's telling you you're too old to be on TikTok. You have these thoughts that's reminding you that you don't know how to use technology. You don't know how to post on social media. You don't know how to add sounds to your video. You don't know anything about hashtags. You have these thoughts that are telling you, hey, what's the point of posting on TikTok when TikTok is about to get banned in a couple of weeks? You have these thoughts that puts limitations on the big things and the big desires that God has placed in your heart. And so the reason why it's going to be so hard for us to have confidence in God is because we trust more in these limiting thoughts than we do in God. And so in order for you to see God move in your life, in order for you to fully go in with God, you are going to have to learn how to break free from the thoughts that are limiting you from moving forward. I want to read to you Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, which says, "For as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you." For context, this verse was explaining why you shouldn't eat or drink with stingy people, but the message can be applied to every aspect of your life. This verse is basically saying the way that you think determines the type of person you are. You can say all the good things that you're supposed to say as much as you want, but your thoughts are always going to be exposed. But your thoughts shows the type of person that you are. Your thoughts are going to determine your actions, your attitude, and your demeanor. I remember studying about how you can always tell when a person is lying. And it says that you can always tell because they tend to show signs. They do things like avoiding eye contact, developing high-pitched voice tones, fidgeting with their hands. They always show some type of sign that what they're saying and the words that are coming out of their mouth is not the truth. It's basically like the deception triggers a psychological stress response that makes them act in odd ways because they know that they're not telling the truth about the situation or about who they are. So when we look at this verse that says, eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. So God is basically saying to you, you can speak good things all day, but if your words do not match who you are, it's going to trigger certain actions in you that's going to make it hard for you to act and believe in the ways that God is calling you to act and believe in. Some of you wonder why your faith is so weary. Some of you wonder why one day you're so full of faith, you're so excited, you're so full of trust in the Lord, and then the next day you're disappointed, and the next day you're discouraged, and the next day you're blind and you can't see how things are going to come through. You feel like, what's the point of trying? And the reason why is because you have not changed who you are inside. You're trying to have faith, but you're not a faith-filled type of person. You're trying to trust God, but you're not a trusting person. You're trying to be obedient to him, but you're not an obedient person. You're trying to stay on the right path, but you're not a consistent and disciplined person. The reason why you are so weary is because you are trying to make moves in an area that does not match who you are. And I'm not saying this to beat you up or to make you feel bad or to make you feel like you are not good enough. I'm saying this so that you can recognize that this is an issue that you have inside yourself and take the effort to change. Because as long as you keep trying to move with God and follow the things that God is calling you to do in the place that you currently are, as the person that you currently are, it's never going to work. You are wondering why you never see God come through. You are wondering why you've been on this journey, you've been following him, you've been trying to have faith, and it just does not seem like he is coming through for you. And it's because you are missing the core piece, the most essential piece to the puzzle, and that is growing as a person and becoming new, growing as a person and changing who you currently are. God is trying to get you to understand this version of you cannot go into that breakthrough. This version of you cannot have that blessing. This version of you cannot handle that. That is why he says that before he gives us something, he prepares us for it. He prepares us for it by stripping things off of us. He prepares us for it by growing us, by exposing things to us and giving us the opportunity to work on ourselves in those areas, because he wants you to understand that the way that you think, the person that you are right now, cannot handle where I am trying to take you to. I want you to understand that this is the process of success. This is the process of if you see success, and this is the process of if you see failure. What you think determines who you are, and who you are determines how you'll act, and how you act determines what you'll see. So again, what you think determines who you are, and who you are determines how you'll act, and how you'll act determines what you'll see. So for example, if you constantly have worried-filled thoughts, every time that God tries to give you a step, every time that something good happens in your life, every time that you try to dream big, you always have thoughts that make you worry. You always have thoughts that make you fearful. You always have thoughts that just make you stress and make anxiety overcome you. Giving into those thoughts are going to make you into a person who worries all of the time. And because you're the type of person who worries all the time, it makes you act slow to obedience. Because instead of jumping and doing what God says when God tells you to do it, you're too busy worrying about how this is going to come together. You're too busy worrying about if this will work. You're too busy worrying about what will go wrong. What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough? You're too busy worrying about everything instead of doing the thing that God tells you to do. Because you have become the type of person who worries, you act in a way of worry. Your actions show the roots of worry. And because you act slow to obedience, it causes you to not see God move in your life. It causes you to be the type of person who procrastinate. It causes you to be the type of person who make excuses. It causes you to be the type of person where God gave you a step, and because you're so afraid to take that step, you're so afraid of what's going to happen if you take that step, instead of being obedient, you keep going to God and asking him for something that he already gave you. It causes you to be that type of person, to act in those type of ways, and that makes you experience an outcome of not seeing God move in your life. The key to seeing your breakthrough The key to seeing God move in your life, the key to being successful is to change who you are by changing how you think. You are going to have to strip yourself from the limitations. You are going to have to strip yourself from all the negative thoughts that are telling you all the things that are hindering you from moving in the direction that God is trying to get you to move to. You are going to have to change your mind, renew your mind if you want to see success. I was watching a Myron Golden interview once, and he said something that really stuck out to me. He was talking about the biggest mistake that people make, and he said, the biggest mistake that people make is looking for what to do instead of who to become. We think about changing everything but ourselves. We think about changing our environment. We think about changing our circumstance. We think about changing what we have. We think about changing the type of life that we live. We think about making all these changes in our life, but the one area that we never seek to change is ourselves. Sometimes we need to stop going to God and asking him, what do I do? And we need to start going to God and asking him, who do I become? How can I become a faith-filled person? How can I become the type of person that pleases you? If I want to be married, how can I become a wife? Or how can I become a husband? We need to stop just going to God and asking him for the thing. We need to stop just going to God and asking him for instructions on what to do to get the thing, but start asking him for instructions on who to become. How can we transform ourselves from the inside out to be the type of person who can handle what we're praying for him to give us? Are you enjoying this episode so far? Is this episode teaching you how to break free from limiting beliefs? If so, I want you to do me 2 favors. Favor number 1, I want you to leave a review. You can leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this episode. Leave an honest review and let me and others know how you are enjoying the show. And favor number 2, if you know anyone who has been struggling with limiting beliefs, maybe there's things that God has been calling them to do, but they've been moving with hesitation because of their thoughts, I want you to send this episode to them. Let this episode motivate and encourage them the same way that it is motivating and encouraging you. Now let's get back to the show. I want to read to you the story of Abraham and Sarah, and we're going to break it up into 2 different parts because it's in 2 different sections of the Bible. So the first part that we're going to read is Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 through 27. It says, "Then God said to Abraham, 'As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her.' Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, 'Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?' And Abraham said to God, 'Oh, that Ishmael might live before you.' Then God said, 'No, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year.' Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So Abraham took Ishmael his son, all who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very same day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very same day, Abraham was circumcised, and his son Ishmael, and all the men of his house, born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him." So the first thing that stood out to me when I was reading this was verse 17, which says, "Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old, and Sarah who is 90 years old?" God gave Abraham a promise. And Abraham's first response was to laugh in disbelief. The reason why Abraham laughed in disbelief is because he gave into a limiting thought. As soon as God gave him this promise, as soon as God told him that he was going to have a son with his wife Sarah, a thought came to him and reminded him, you are about to be 100 years old. Your wife is 90 years old. It is unrealistic for someone as old as you to give birth to a child. And I want you to pay attention to how that limiting thought caused Abraham to respond, because immediately he did not respond in faith. Immediately he did not respond by obeying God. Number one, he laughed. And then when we get to verse 18, he came up with a more realistic solution. He told God, oh, this is going to happen through Ishmael, my son that is already here, my son that is already born. He tried to go with a realistic route, something that actually made sense, because he felt like what God was saying did not make sense. He felt like what God was saying was not going to happen. Not only did he create this realistic solution, but he actually spoke that realistic solution right back to God. He told God, oh, you must be talking about Ishmael. But God was so merciful that he confirmed his promise to Abraham again, and he gave him more clarity. He spoke to him in verse 19 and said, no, this is not about Ishmael. No, this is not about the child that you already have. This child is going to come from your wife. Look past how old you are. Look past how old your wife is. Look past what looks realistic. Look past what looks likely to happen and trust what I am saying. Because my covenant was not anointed for Ishmael. My covenant was not anointed for your realistic solution. My covenant is anointed in what I said. And if you want to see my covenant come to pass, you have to make the decision to trust me. And I want you to take note of this, because as humans, our brain can only think so big. I don't think that there's a person on this earth who doesn't still struggle with limiting and realistic thoughts, at least a little bit. So there's going to be times in your life where God is calling you to something big. God is promising you something big. God is promising you something that nobody around you feels like it's possible to happen. And you are going to struggle. You are going to have those thoughts in your head that is trying to tell you why God's word is not going to come to pass. You are going to try to create more realistic solutions to better serve yourself in this season instead of holding on to what God is telling you to do. And in those moments where you are struggling, that is the time for you to ask God to confirm himself to you again and give you clarity. Do not make the mistake of thinking that God is going to be angry at you for this. He didn't get angry with Abraham. He gave him more understanding, and he will do the exact same thing for you. The second thing that stood out to me is that after God confirmed his promise to Abraham the second time, Abraham immediately took his son and his servants and he circumcised them just as God instructed. Immediately after God confirmed the promise, Abraham took steps in obedience. Now, I'm not 100% sure if after the second time that God confirmed his promise, if Abraham fully believed him, if all the doubts and the realisticness that he was looking at, if all of that just immediately went away. But all I know is that he made the decision to move in obedience. So many of us allow our limiting thoughts to make us move with hesitation. Where we're moving, but we're doing it from a place of fear. We're moving, but we're scared to move all the way because what if this doesn't work? What if we're crazy? What if we didn't hear God correctly? We give more trust into these thoughts than we do into what God said to us. But instead of moving with hesitation, we have to take a book from Abraham and we have to learn how to move with faith. You know, we always say that faith is not going by what you see, but sometimes faith is also not going by what you think. Sometimes faith is not going by what you feel. So despite the thoughts that are telling us that what God said is impossible, that is never going to happen, we have to let God's words, we have to let God's promises be enough for us to move. Faith is not an emotion. Faith is a decision. You're going to feel negative emotions on your faith journey. You're going to think negative thoughts on your faith journey, but you still have to make the decision to go against what you are feeling, go against what you are thinking, and move in faith and trust God on what He says. Now we're going to read Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 15, which says, "Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth tree of Mamre as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground and said, 'My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought and wash your feet and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant.' They said, 'Do as you have said.' So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, 'Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes.' And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate. Then they said to him, 'Where is Sarah your wife?' So he said, 'Here in the tent.' And he said, 'I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah your wife shall have a son.' Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, well advanced in age, and Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. Therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, 'After I have grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also?' And the Lord said to Abraham, 'Why does Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I surely bear a child since I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son.' But Sarah denied it, saying, 'I did not laugh,' for she was afraid. And he said, 'No, but you did laugh.'" The first thing that stood out to me when I was reading this is that after the men confirmed to Abraham that Sarah was going to give birth to a son, it didn't just say that Sarah laughed. Verse 12 says that Sarah laughed within herself. This means that she didn't laugh out loud. This means that she didn't say this in a way where Abraham and the men can hear her. This means that she laughed in her head, that the laugh was a thought, that the words that are listed in verse 12 is something that Sarah thought to herself. Sarah struggled with the same limiting, realistic thoughts that Abraham struggled with when God first said this to him. She felt like she was too old. She felt like she was past the childbearing age. She felt like her husband was too old. She felt like this was something that was not likely to happen. That thought came in her head and mocked her, where the thought made her laugh and say, "Don't even listen to that. Don't even give in to that. That's never going to happen." And one of the most amazing things to me about this story is that God wanted this promise to happen so much. God cared about Abraham and Sarah so much that he spoke to Sarah in an area that she never even voiced. She never voiced her opinion on that promise. She never spoke out loud and gave life to that promise. All she did was think about it, and God wanted to assure her on her thoughts. That's why he sent Abraham with that message. That's why he sent Abraham to remind her that nothing was too hard for him, that this was not something she should laugh about, because he has the power to do it despite her age, despite Abraham's age, despite what she feels is realistic. He wanted to reassure her on something that she never even voiced out loud. Although she denied it because she was fearful, God's intention was not to punish her or yell at her. God's intention was to stop that thought from taking root in Sarah's heart, because if she was to give into that thought and let that thought take root into her heart, then that seed that she planted would start to grow in her heart and cloud judgment on how she thought, cloud judgment on who she was, cloud judgment on how she decided to move next. In the same way, that God did not want that seed to take root in Sarah's heart, God does not want that seed to take root in yours. If you have been in a place where you have been struggling to trust God on the things that He promised to do in your life, then I want you to pay attention to what He said in verse 13. Actually, sorry, it was verse 14, where He said, nothing is too hard for Him. You have a decision to make on who you are going to trust. Are you going to trust the thoughts that are coming into your head and reminding you of why this thing will never happen for you? Are you going to allow those thoughts to take root in your heart and block God from being able to bring your breakthrough? Or are you going to make the decision to hold on to what God promised you? Hold on to the things that God said to you and allow that to take root in your heart. Allow that to come into you and show you the direction to go in, show you how to make this come to pass, show you what you need to do, show you the steps of obedience that you need to take. It is up to you how this is going to play out. And if you made the decision to allow God's promises to take root, you first have to pull up the roots that you have been planting in your heart of those limiting thoughts. And the first way to do that is a way that we kind of touched on already, but it's to stop asking God what to do and start asking God who to become. Ask God, how can you become more like Him? Ask God, how can you think more like Him? Think about the area that God has promised you. If you're like Abraham and Sarah, where God promised you a child, you should be asking Him, God, how can I become a godly mother? God, how can I become a godly father? If the area that God has promised you is marriage, then God, how can I become a godly wife? How can I become a godly husband? If the area that God has promised you is financial stability, God, how can I become the type of person who is financially stable? How can I become a disciplined person? If the area that God has promised you is home ownership, then God, how can I become the type of person who owns a home? Ask God how to transform yourself and become the type of person who walks in that breakthrough, who walks in that blessing. The second thing that you want to do is you want to determine the areas of unbelief that you have planted in your heart and ask yourself, why are you struggling to trust what God said to you? You can't break something if you don't know what needs to be broken. If you do not understand which thoughts you are having that is wrong, if you do not understand which thoughts that you are having that needs to be broken, that needs to go away, then you will never be able to get rid of them because you don't know what you're looking for. You want to ask yourself, what thoughts is making me fearful? What thoughts is making me worry? What thoughts is pushing me away from God? What thoughts is making me not want to give in to God? What thoughts are breaking my faith? And then ask yourself, why am I believing those thoughts? For Abraham and Sarah, we know that the thoughts that was breaking their faith was the thoughts that was telling them their age was not enough. See, when you understand what thoughts are breaking your faith, you can give those thoughts to God and say, God, I'm struggling. I'm believing this. I'm giving into this. Help me in this area. Not only can you give them to God, but you also can speak the opposite of those thoughts. So if you're like Abraham and Sarah, where the thoughts are telling you you're too old to have a child, you can start speaking, this is the perfect age for God to bless me with a seed. This is the perfect age for God to make me a mother. You can start speaking the opposite of that and start speaking those things until you start to believe it in your heart. Start giving your brain new thoughts to think about. Start giving your brain new perspectives to take. Start speaking the promises that God gave you and stop speaking the lies of the enemy. And the last thing that you want to do is you want to detach discipline from your mind. Remember, your obedience is not determined by what you think. Your obedience is not determined by how you feel. Your obedience is determined by what God told you to do. And so my action step for you today So I want you to think about the promise that God gave you and take it back to Him asking, who do I need to become in order to operate in this promise? But that's all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure that you subscribe so that you get a notification every time a new episode is released. Also, leave a review and let me and others know how you enjoyed the show. And if you want to stay connected, follow me on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook at Prospering with Christ. But that's all I have for you today, and I will see you next week.